Is this your first time on a base, old-timer? The voice was sharp and mean. It cut through the quiet sounds of the mess hall. Captain Evans, with his captain's bars shining under the bright lights, smiled down at the old man sitting alone. You look a little lost. Robert Henderson, 84 years old, didn't look up from his coffee. He stirred the dark drink in the thick mug. His hand was old and wrinkled but steady. His eyes, the color of a cloudy sky, stayed on the small circle he was making in his cup. The captain stood with two younger officers who wanted to act just like him. They looked at each other with impatient looks. "I'm talking to you," Evans said louder now. People at nearby tables started to look. "This area is for active duty people. Let me see some ID." He said it like someone who had never been told no before. He wore his uniform like it made him important, like a shield that made him feel 10 feet tall. The mess hall on a Tuesday was full of noise. Trays clattering, chairs scraping, people talking about training and weekend plans and the dry chicken. But around Robert's small table, it was starting to get quiet. Young airmen stopped eating and watched what was happening. They looked curious and uncomfortable. Captain Evans, enjoying the attention, leaned forward and put his hands flat on Robert's table. The thud made the coffee cup jump. "ID now, or I'll have security forces show you to the front gate." His voice was no longer playful. It was a command, a small show of power in his own little kingdom. Robert finally looked up. His look wasn't angry or scared or even annoyed. It was calm and steady, and it carried a heaviness that seemed to make the captain nervous for a moment. Slowly, carefully, Robert reached into the pocket of his old red leather jacket. The jacket was ancient, cracked and faded from time and hard use. It smelled faintly of engine oil and cold air. He pulled out a simple, worn leather wallet. From it, he took out a card with rounded edges and a photo of a much younger man with the same steady eyes. He placed it on the table without saying a word. Evans grabbed the card. He held it up to the light like he was in a play. "Retired," he said with a mean laugh, reading the card. "Figures. Enjoying the free meal paid for by taxpayers, are we?" He tossed the card back onto the table where it slid to a stop next to the salt shaker. His officer friends laughed quietly. The captain wasn't done. His eyes looked at Robert's simple clothes, the comfortable pants, the plain shirt, the old jacket. His eyes stopped on a small pin on the jacket. It was a simple silver pin, not shiny or fancy. It was old and worn. "What's this little thing?" Evans asked, his voice making fun. He reached out and flicked the pin with his fingernail. The sharp little tink sound echoed in the growing quiet. "Did you win this at the VFW raffle? A prize for oldest vet there?" The airmen at the nearby tables moved uncomfortably. This had crossed a line from being rude to being mean. An old man was being made fun of in the very place he had once served. The quiet wasn't just quiet anymore. It was heavy, thick with silent disapproval. Evans, however, was too caught up in his own show to notice the change. He saw only an old man who wouldn't get mad, and it made him angry. "I asked you a question, old man," Evans said, his voice rising. "This is my Air Force now. We have standards. We don't just let any civilian wander in and play soldier." Robert's calm stayed like a wall. He simply looked at the captain, his face unchanging. This calm refusal to answer seemed to make Evans more frustrated than any angry words could have. The captain felt his power being quietly questioned, not by a challenge, but by complete silence. He was a captain. He was used to people answering him. He was used to respect. This quiet old man gave him nothing, and by doing so, took everything. The tension grew. Evans felt everyone's eyes on him. He had started this, and now he had to finish it. He couldn't just walk away. It would look like a silent old man had beaten him. "You know what? I think you're trespassing," Evans announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. The last few conversations stopped. Every eye was on them now. "Your ID could be fake. That jacket, that pin, you probably bought them at a surplus store to get a free lunch. It's pathetic, really." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a mean whisper. "I could have you in a cell for the next 6 hours while we check your story. Is that what you want? To spend your afternoon explaining yourself to security?" Still, Robert said nothing. His silence was like an anchor in the captain's storm of words. It was deep and unmoving, and it was beginning to make the captain look crazy. The two officers behind him were no longer smiling. They were staring at their boots, wishing they were anywhere else. The show had gone bad. The flick of the pin. The sharp tink of a fingernail on old silver. For a split second, the bright lights of the mess hall were gone. In their place was screaming wind, the loud roar of 4 engines working as hard as they could. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and fear. Below, through the broken glass of the cockpit, Bursts of anti-aircraft fire painted the night sky a deadly orange. A younger Robert Henderson, his face lit by the red glow of the controls, reached over to his co-pilot, a kid named Miller, who was slumped over in his seat, his flight suit stained dark with blood. With a shaking hand, Robert removed the identical silver pin from Miller's jacket before the fire ate everything. It wasn't a prize, it was a promise, a memory of the price. Snap back, the mess hall, the sneering face of a boy playing soldier. From a table near the back wall, Airman First Class Sarah Miller watched, her stomach churning. Her hands were balled into fists under the table. She knew Captain Evans by reputation, arrogant, demanding, and insecure. But this was different. This was cruel. The old man, in his quiet dignity, reminded her of her own grandfather, a Vietnam vet who rarely spoke of his service, but carried himself with that same unbreakable calm. She saw the flick of the pin, heard the captain's mocking words, and felt a wave of protective anger. She couldn't confront a captain directly. That would end her career. But she couldn't do nothing. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. There's always a right way to do the right thing. Quietly, she slid her phone from her pocket, keeping it below the table. Her fingers moved quickly across the screen. She didn't dial 911. She didn't call security. She went to the base's phone directory and found the number for the wing command office. She pressed the call button and lifted the phone to her ear, turning her body away from the drama. A calm, professional voice answered. 12th Air Wing Command, Staff Sergeant Davis speaking. Sergeant, Sarah whispered, her voice tight and urgent. This is Airman Miller. I'm in the main mess hall at Falcon's Landing. What's the situation, Airman? There's an incident. Captain Evans from Logistics he's publicly harassing an elderly veteran. Sarah took a breath, trying to keep her voice steady. It's getting really bad. The captain is threatening to have him arrested. Understood, Airman. Can you get the veteran's name? Sarah squinted, trying to see the ID card still lying on the table. I think so. The captain threw his ID back on the table. Let me try to see. She stood up, pretending to stretch, craning her neck. The angle was bad. Just a second. She walked as if heading for the drink station, her path taking her just close enough to steal a glance at the table as she passed. The name on the faded card was clear for a brief moment. She walked on a few more paces before speaking into the phone again, her back to the scene. Sergeant, she said, her voice barely a whisper now. The name on the ID is Henderson. Robert Henderson. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Not a long one, but a beat of pure silence. When Staff Sergeant Davis spoke again, the calm, professional tone was gone. In its place was a sharp, urgent sound that made the hair on Sarah's arm stand up. Airman Miller, he said, his voice low and intense. Say that name again. Spell it out for me. Henderson, she whispered. Robert. Another pause, this time filled with the frantic sound of keyboard clicking. Oh God, Davis breathed into the phone. Airman, stay on the line, but do not get involved. Do you understand me? Do not approach the captain. Help is on the way. The line didn't disconnect, but she could hear him shouting, his voice muffled, to someone else in the office. The words she could make out were, get the colonel now. In the fancy wood-paneled office of the wing commander, Colonel Ann Jensen was in the middle of a meeting about budget problems. Charts and graphs were on the wall, and the air was thick with boring talk about money. Her focus was complete until her assistant, a young but very good master sergeant, burst into the room without knocking, a terrible thing to do. Colonel, I apologize for the interruption, but you need to hear this, he said, his face pale and his eyes wide. Colonel Jensen, a woman known for staying calm, fixed him with a cold stare. Sergeant, this had better be a matter of war. It might as well be, ma'am, he said, leaning in and lowering his voice. We just got a call from the mess hall. An officer is harassing a visitor. Ma'am, the visitor's name is Robert Henderson. The name hung in the air for a moment, and its effect on Colonel Jensen was immediate and powerful. The color drained from her face. The pen in her hand dropped to the polished table with a clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. She stood up so quickly her heavy chair scraped backward across the floor. Where? She demanded, her voice tight and controlled. Falcon's Landing, ma'am. Main mess hall. Get my car, she snapped, already grabbing her service cap from its stand. Bring it to the front entrance now. She turned to the shocked officers at the table. This meeting is over. As her assistant scrambled to obey, she added one more order, her voice filled with shock and terror. And get the base chief on the radio. Tell him to meet me there. Tell him it's a broken arrow situation. He'll understand. It was a code they hadn't used in years, saved for a crisis of the highest importance on the base. For Colonel Jensen, this qualified. The name Robert Henderson wasn't just a name. It was a legend, a foundational pillar of the institution she served. And a captain under her command was at this very moment disrespecting that pillar in the most public way possible. Back in the mess hall, Captain Evans, made bold by Robert's continued silence, prepared to deliver his final crushing blow. The silent disapproval of the room now felt like a challenge to his authority, one he had to win for sure. He puffed out his chest and pointed to the two security airmen who stood near the entrance, watching the scene with professional unease. "All right, that's enough of this," Evans announced to everyone. "This man is clearly confused and is a potential security risk." He pointed a stiff finger at Robert. "I want him escorted off this base. Take him to the civilian authorities for a full psychological evaluation. He's obviously not fit to be on a federal installation." It was too much. He wasn't just removing an annoyance. He was trying to strip an old man of his dignity and his sanity in front of a crowd of his fellow servicemen. A few of the younger airmen gasped. This was no longer a simple matter of disrespect. It was a terrible abuse of power. The two security airmen began to walk forward, their faces grim. They were following an order from a superior officer, but it was clear from the slowness in their steps that they knew it was wrong. Just as the first airman reached the table, the main doors of the mess hall flew open with a bang that made everyone jump. They didn't swing open gently. They were thrown open, crashing against the stoppers on the wall. Standing in the doorway, outlined by the bright afternoon sun, was Colonel Ann Jensen. She was flanked by the base chief master sergeant, a man whose face was a thundercloud of controlled rage, and a security detail of 4 armed airmen who moved with deadly seriousness. The arrival was a physical shockwave. The low murmur of the room vanished, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like the air had been sucked out of the building. Forks stopped. Trays were held still. Every single person in that hall, from the newest airman to the civilian cooks in the back, froze. Colonel Jensen's eyes swept the room, cold and sharp. Her gaze passed over the shocked officers, the scared airmen, and landed on Captain Evans. She didn't look at him directly. Her look was one of pure dismissal, as if he were a piece of furniture she had to walk around. Her entire group moved forward with a single purpose. Their polished boots hit the floor in a heavy rhythmic sound that sounded like a drumbeat of doom. They parted the sea of tables and staring onlookers. Their path was aimed directly at the small table, where the old man in the leather jacket still sat, calmly watching them approach. Captain Evans stood frozen, like a deer caught in headlights. He watched the wing commander, the highest authority on the entire base, march past him as if he didn't exist. The world had just tilted, and he was losing his balance. Colonel Jensen came to a stop exactly 3 feet from Robert Henderson's chair. The Chief Master Sergeant stopped at her shoulder, standing perfectly straight. For a moment, she just looked at the old man, and her expression, previously a mask of cold fury, softened into one of deep and unmistakable respect. Then, in a movement that was impossibly crisp and loaded with meaning, Colonel Jensen drew her body to attention. She raised her right hand to her forehead, her fingers perfectly aligned, and gave the sharpest, most respectful salute of her distinguished career. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice ringing with an authority that stunned the entire room into a deeper silence. "On behalf of the entire 12th Air Wing, I want to apologize for the reception you have received. It is an honor to have you on my base, sir." The word "sir" hung in the air, electric and world-changing. The base chief snapped a salute of his own, his eyes locked on Robert with an expression of awe. Captain Evans' jaw went slack. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing. A full colonel was saluting a VFW raffle winner? It made no sense. Robert Henderson finally moved. He gave a slow, gentle nod to the colonel. "At ease, Anne," he said, his voice quiet but carrying easily through the silent hall. He knew her name. Colonel Jensen dropped her salute but remained at attention. She turned not to face Evans, but to address the entire population of the mess hall, her voice taking on the quality of a powerful lecture. "For those of you who do not know," she began, her gaze sweeping across the young, confused faces, "you are in the presence of a living legend. This is Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force, retired Robert Henderson." A collective gasp went through the room. The title was mythical, the highest possible enlisted rank, the senior enlisted advisor to the Chief of Staff and the Secretary of the Air Force. There was only one at any given time. This quiet old man was not just a veteran, He was a titan, a foundational figure in the history of their service. Jensen continued, her voice filled with powerful rhythm. This man flew 42 combat missions over North Vietnam as a B-52 gunner. He is a recipient of the Air Force Cross for bravery in action, awarded for defending his crew and his damaged aircraft for over 2 hours against repeated enemy fighter attacks, allowing his crew to bail out before the aircraft was lost. She paused, letting the weight of that sink in. After his time in the air, he didn't stop serving. As a chief, he led the development of the modern professional military education system that every enlisted member in this room has gone through. He personally championed the pay and quality of life reforms of the 1980s that ensure you have decent housing and benefits. The very structure of the Air Force you serve in today was built on the foundations this man laid. All around the room, the reaction was a slow, dawning wave of realization. Young airmen, one by one, then in groups, began to stand up. It wasn't an order. It was a spontaneous pull of respect. Soon, every service member in the room was on their feet, their eyes fixed on the humble old man in the leather jacket. The shame on the faces of the two officers who had stood with Evans was clear. They looked like they wanted the floor to swallow them whole. Only then, after establishing the legend, did Colonel Jensen finally turn her icy, controlled gaze upon Captain Evans. The full weight of her command authority descended upon him. Her voice was not loud, but it was the coldest, sharpest thing in the room, a weapon sharpened by years of leadership. "Captain," she said, the single word dripping with contempt, "you are relieved of your duties. Effective immediately, my assistant will escort you to my office. You will wait there for me. You will not speak to anyone. You will not touch your phone. Is that understood?" Evans, his face the color of ash, could only manage a choked, "Yes, ma'am." He looked as if he had been physically hit, but before the assistant could take his arm, Robert Henderson finally spoke, his voice rough from not being used but clear as a bell in the quiet hall. "Colonel," he said gently, raising a hand, "let the boy be for a moment." Colonel Jensen paused, her expression questioning. Robert turned his calm, ancient eyes on the disgraced captain. There was no anger in them, no victory, only a deep, profound sadness. "Son," Robert said, his voice soft, "that rank you wear on your collar, it isn't a crown. It's not there to make you feel big or to give you power over others." He tapped his own chest where a ghost of stripes from decades past seemed to be. "Rank is a weight. It's a burden you carry on your shoulders for every single airman you are responsible for. Their well-being, their growth, their lives. That is the weight. You should feel it every morning when you get dressed. The moment it starts to feel light is the moment you are no longer fit to lead." He looked down at the small silver pin on his jacket that Evans had mocked. "This," he said, "this is just a reminder of the price of failing to carry that weight properly." The screaming wind, the burning plane. A young Robert is on his knees in the dark, smoky cabin. He is trying to get his co-pilot Miller out of his seat, but it's no use. Miller is gone. The fire is everywhere. "I'm sorry, kid," Robert whispers, his voice breaking. He takes the pin from Miller's jacket. It's hot to the touch. It's a promise to remember, a symbol of the ultimate weight of leadership, the names and faces of those you couldn't bring home. It wasn't a trophy of bravery. It was a scar, a heavy silver scar. The fallout for Captain Evans was swift and silent. There was no public court-martial, no grand show. His career simply ended. After a harsh, one-sided conversation in Colonel Jensen's office, he was moved to a windowless room in the base records department, tasked with digitizing old supply records from the 1970s. It was a clear and embarrassing message. You are no longer a leader. You are a keeper of the past. Within 6 months, his resignation was quietly accepted. The more significant change, however, was institutional. Colonel Jensen, deeply shaken by the incident, required a new addition to the base's Officer Professional Development Program. It was a 2-hour block of instruction on military heritage and the responsibilities of leadership, taught by the base chief master sergeant himself. The centerpiece of the course was an anonymous case study about a young, arrogant captain and a quiet, humble legend in a mess hall. It became a cautionary tale, a powerful lesson in humility that spread to other bases. The story of what happened at Falcon's Landing became a quiet part of Air Force lore. A few months later, a man in simple civilian clothes was pushing a shopping cart through a local grocery store. He was thinner, and the arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet reserve. As he rounded the corner of the canned goods aisle, he saw him. Robert Henderson was standing there, carefully studying the labels on different brands of soup. The man, the former Captain Evans, froze, his heart hammered in his chest. He could have turned, walked away, and Robert would have never known, but he didn't. He took a deep, shaky breath and walked forward. "Mr. Henderson," he said, his voice barely a croak. Robert turned, his calm eyes showing a flicker of recognition. I'm Daniel Evans," he stammered, feeling foolish for even saying his name. "I was the captain in the mess hall." It was hard to get the words out. The shame was still a fresh, raw wound. "I never had the chance to properly apologize. What I did was inexcusable. There is no excuse. I was arrogant and I was cruel, and I am so, so sorry." Robert Henderson looked at the humbled young man for a long moment. He studied his face, seeing not the arrogant officer, but a man wrestling with a hard-learned lesson. He set his can of soup in his cart, and then, to Evans's surprise, reached out and placed a firm, steady hand on his shoulder. "Son," Robert said, his voice gentle, "we all have days where we are not our best selves. The measure of a man isn't in whether he falls. It's in whether he gets back up and learns from it." He gave a slight nod. "Just be a better man tomorrow than you were yesterday. That's all any of us can do." He squeezed Evan's shoulder once, then turned back to the soup. The conversation was over. For Daniel Evans, it was the beginning of a long road. For Robert Henderson, it was just another Tuesday. The story of Philip Bradford is a powerful reminder that heroes walk among us, often in the quietest, most unassuming forms. The greatest strength is not in the rank on a collar, but in the character of the heart. If you were moved by this story of unassuming valor, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for